right? It's going to be 0 tonight, huh? Going to be 0 tonight, huh? Well, that means it's going to be a rough night for the Brass Monkeys. Again. Now, it's a funny thing about cold weather, and I might as well warn you before we go any further tonight. Tonight's program is about the unattainable, the secret mystery, the awful thing that lies just beyond that great black curtain out there. And it has to do with cold weather. So don't turn away. Stick your head out the window for just a moment. Really. I mean, really, feel it. Look out there in the dark. Well, now, there's something very exciting about very, very cold weather. And I come from a section of the country where cold weather is far more common in the wintertime than the other kind. As a matter of fact, I hear tonight that in Chicago it's around 18 or 20 below, something like that. And in the last couple of days, it hasn't been any warmer in Chicago than 13 below. Well, let me tell you something about cold weather. And this is not going to be a program that is nostalgic about cold weather at all. Not at all. Don't get excited there. I can remember one night as a kid lying on a daybed looking out of the window. We had kind of a front bedroom, you see, and you could look out into the dark, and about a block away across over a deserted prairie, there was a road, and along this road stretched a streetcar tracks. Now, above the streetcar tracks, of course, was the streetcar wires. Now, for those of you who don't know what a streetcar is, because obviously we don't have streetcars in New York, they still have them in Philadelphia, you know. Oh, yes. A streetcar is a streetcar. It's like, I'll tell you, kid, it's like a one-car subway that's above ground, if you can imagine such a thing, kid. And it rides along right in the middle of the street. And it has a big antenna sticking out of the top of it. And on the top of that antenna is a little round wheel. And that round wheel runs along a wire. Now, that's where it gets its juice. Well, I can remember lying on the daybed at about, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening. It was dark. The temperature was hovering between 25 and 30 below zero, which is considerably colder than what we've got here right now tonight. Well, every half hour or so, a streetcar would go past. And this was why I was watching. Because of the tremendous cold, the wires had contracted so much that the streetcars were having trouble, and also because of other things that are involved in copper wire. When it gets very cold, you see, things happen. The resistance changes, and a lot of other things happen to it. Are you aware of that? And so the old streetcars would go along, and as they would go along, there would be a thin coating of, well, it's a kind of frost that forms in the air when very, very cold weather hits. This frost would form on the wire, and these wheels would move along in the dark, and there'd be great sheets of white flame. The streetcar would go past. And I would wait, you see. And you just see, it was just like, I'll tell you what it looked like. It looked like an enormous blue-white skyrocket going from left to right, directly across a totally black landscape. The streetcar would leave that trail. And then for a few seconds after the streetcar would go past, you would see, because of the heat generated, because of that, you'd see little sparks along the wire. And then it would be quiet again. And then a couple of minutes later, the streetcar would go the opposite direction. Well, then the very thing that we would be waiting for would happen, if we were lucky, while it was being watched. One of the wires would contract so much that the wire would come down, a great explosion. The wire would land on that street, which was covered with ice, and great big blue flames for about 5 minutes. And then the trucks would come. Well, now the reason that we're telling this story tonight, and I'm going to have to warn you, tonight's story is about amateur radio. Because very cold weather like this always reminds me, it causes my keying finger to itch. which is on my right hand. I could just feel it. It begins to itch. I can feel a little. It must be like an old golfer who, when he looks out and sees just the slightest edge of sun peering down and maybe one or two blades of grass, his putting hand begins to, he feels it down in the knees, and he wants to get out there and start flubbing around again. Well, I feel the itch in the old keying finger. Because it is on nights like this at about 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning when the temperature hovers around zero that you never know what's going to happen. Absolutely have no idea, because out of the blue comes the most uncanny signals. The most wild things can happen on a night like this in amateur radio. And of course, to those of you who don't know what amateur radio, speaking of amateur radio, this is WOR, AM and FM, New York. And we have here, let's get a couple of commercials out of the way, and then we'll go on with this story, because it concerns the achievement of the unattainable. Yeah, once in a while you achieve it, and it's very scary, and you'll never forget it. In man's desperate race into space, will mankind be left behind? Will America's new space frontier create a new culture, or will it destroy old heritages in the name of progress? The present hard-hitting current issue of Show magazine explores these and other important aspects. Important issue. Yes, the future has become showbiz. There. Boy, that's very exciting. We also, speaking of showbiz, we have with us too, and this I'm going to go through very briefly because it's a very special kind of announcement for anybody who has an institution, for example, a school, a college. I'm an amateur radio operator, and I want to tell you something about that. I just feel in a mood tonight to talk about something. Now, if you don't want to hear about it, you can scoot over and listen to Mondovani or something, or that Haydn Quartet, or whatever jazz you're looking for. But when I was a kid, it's very funny. When something happens to you that literally changes the whole course of your life, you hardly ever know that it has happened. Well, I recall an incident that really did do that to me. I was fooling around. There were 2 or 3 kids in the neighborhood who built radios. And they were older kids, and of course they were official kids. And I was always trying to be like the bigger kids, That's just the way kids are. And I was building little radios and fooling around. And one day, a kid in school with me, his name was Ray Galambas. I'll never forget him. Ray Galambas, whom I've never mentioned on this show previously. But Ray Galambas. Ray Galambas one day discovered I built radios. And he says, "My old man builds radios." And I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Yeah." And with that, he took me home to see his old man. Well, let me tell you what I was confronted with. I had never seen this before. I had heard only vague rumors of it because I was reading the shortwave magazines. There was a magazine called Shortwave Craft, which I read. In this man's room was a set of enormous rack and panels. I'll tell you what it looked like. It looked like the mad scientist scene from the terrible movies you see. Tremendous, fantastic thing with meters all over it. And this guy is sitting down at his desk, and he has a microphone, and he's talking to people. Talking to people. Well, I took one look at this, and I was out of my skull. It must be what happens when some kid suddenly discovered the theater or something. You always hear about the guy, being taken to the theater, and all of a sudden, this is it. He discovers his world. Well, I discovered that world that day, and I went out of the house in a daze. I fell down the stairs, and I got up, and I staggered home, and I sat there in a delirium for about 3 days, and finally went back to this guy and said, "How do you get to be one?" And he said, "Well, it is very hard, kid." Well, he was understating the case. So within about 3 days, I had gotten all the textbooks on it, and I began to study. Now, remember, I'm a kid in school. I'm only about, 13 or 14 at the time, and I had just begun high school, and I was having a tough time getting acclimated to high school, and suddenly I got hooked on this thing. Well, there was nobody around that I could talk to. Now, that's very important. Only this man, and this man lived on the other side of town, and I hardly ever saw him. He was very unattainable. He was a big man in the steel mill. And so I began to work in private on this insane thing. I began to read all these books about this very mystical science. Well, of course, what it was literally electronic theory of transmission. It was transmitter radio theory. I could go on and tell you what textbooks they were, but nevertheless, I began to study this incomprehensible thing. Remember, I was right now having trouble with the parts of speech. That was all, really. And I was having trouble already with just algebra with one unknown, you know, and just flubbing along. And I suddenly got involved in this highly technical, completely removed study. And it got a hold of me. It got a hold of me so much that I couldn't stop all day long. I am reading this stuff. I'm in school. I'm in geography class, and hidden in my geography book is a Q&A, which to the uninitiated is the question and answer manual. I would have the amateur radio handbook, and I'm studying, and it's beginning to get me. It's beginning to develop a terrible thing with me. It's like the white whale. Getting a license became to me, well, it became almost like what today's novelist must think, the pursuit of love, you know, or the pursuit of understanding, or the pursuit of all-encompassing, beautiful, forever young peace, or whatever it is that the great novelist is pursuing. I began to pursue this insane white whale. I knew that I had to learn all of this to get a license, as well as learn the code. Well, I don't know whether you've ever tried to learn the amateur radio code all by yourself. Well, it's like trying to learn a language with nobody around to teach you the language, nobody to talk it to you, and those who do speak it to you speak so fast, so colloquially, so insanely beautifully that you can't even comprehend one word. You know, it goes. Well, I had built this radio, and I began to listen to the code. And I memorized the code from the book, and I began to try to copy down words, letters, you know, and it's going insanely. And I'd write down one word. I'd get one word out of like a half an hour. One word, A. And then I just C. I got one. E. Oh, day after day after day. But the beautiful thing then that began to happen, I stuck to this like I was a nut. And my mother would come in, and I'd be sitting there with the cans on my head, and I've got sheets of paper, and I'm writing down D, F, Q, and it's going through my head like an endless maze. I was only hearing this, and I was getting none of it. It was just like suddenly being dropped in the middle of Nigeria, and they're talking Yoruba, hour after